Right about now.
Right about now.
You're about to witness
The Funk Soul Brother.
Jonathan Small.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking to David Grann, author of the book Killers of the Flower Moon, which premiered as a movie over the weekend, taking in $23 million in the U.S. box office. It's the largest box office opening for Martin Scorsese since Shutter Island debuted in February of 2010. It was the number 2 movie in the country. All right, so obviously a big hit. And let me tell you something. I saw the movie. Highly, highly recommended. It's long. I'm not going to lie. It's like 3.5 hours long. Probably could be about a half an hour, 45 minutes shorter, but it was completely riveting. It's an incredible story, very, very sad story with amazing performances. You will love this movie. So I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend the book, which is where this all originated. So I did this interview with David a few years ago, and he had just released the book at that time. So you'll get a little insight into what he was thinking right when the book came out. David takes us through his writing origin story, which is really interesting considering he's one of the most successful nonfiction writers alive today. We talk about how he discovered the story of the Osage murders. We talk about his journey to Oklahoma, meeting with tribe leaders, and he lets us in a little bit on his writing and researching process. This guy does exhaustive research. And one thing I love about David, and confession, I've known the guy for 30 years, is that he is completely transparent, completely not full of himself, and is really kind of a self-proclaimed geek. He loves to nerd out and research before he writes his amazing prose. He also knows his limitations and is not afraid to admit those. And he talks about that in this story. So it's kind of refreshing to hear somebody who's so successful like David talking about how he found his lane. So I found a lot of value in this. Loved talking to him. See the movie. Without further ado, I bring you David Grann.
Right about now.
David Grann, welcome to Right About Now.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
It is a pleasure to have you on, my old friend from many, many years ago when we hung out at the Quad at Connecticut College. Actually, I was thinking back, and you took Blanche Boyd's journalism classes with me, correct? Did you take creative journalism with me?
I did. And were we in the same class together? I definitely took a class with her.
I think we were.
You know, she actually really was the first person who kind of exposed me to more literary journalism. You know, up until that point, I had focused more on history and politics, and I always had an interest in writing, but she was the first person, both through her own teaching, her own writing, and also just the book she taught. I still remember she gave us, it was a collection that Tom Wolfe had put together. It wasn't his works, but it was various new journalism that he chose, and it had a number of works that have stayed with me over the years.
Yeah, me too. That class made a huge impression on me and kind of changed my life, honestly. It probably made me into a journalist. All right. You grew up in a real powerful publishing household. Your mom, Phyllis, was a big-time publisher, right? She ran Putnam Books.
Yes. She ran Putnam, and then she was head of Penguin when Penguin merged with Putnam for a period, and she was at Simon & Schuster before that. And she really was a fairly trailblazing in her field. I think from my memories reading news clips and stuff growing up, she was kind of the first woman at various prominent publishing houses to hold certain positions like editor-in-chief and to run a publishing house.
And you had sort of famous writers in and out of your life, right? Like Tom Clancy was one of her writers. And
Yes. You know, Judy Blume was a large presence in her life when I was growing up. Dick Francis, historian Scott Bird. You know, in a way, I suppose my first and early interest in writing, I think it became not so much because of what my mom was doing, but just kind of being around authors and reading their works when I was young got my interest in being a writer.
And did you have conversations with them when you were younger about, what it was like to be a professional writer?
I was really little. And so, my memories were often, my mom would often take me to like sales conference when she would go for book conferences and I would meet them. And I was, I remember being, 6 or 7 or 8 and kind of wearing a very uncomfortable tie and kind of just hanging out. And I don't think my questions were that cerebral. They probably, I wish in a way I could go back and have some of them now.
Exactly.
And their works. I mean, I read Judy Blume from when I was very little. First from the Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing to then, you're getting older and you're stealing the book that's hidden on the upper shelf.
So that obviously had a tremendous impact. At what point did you sort of know you wanted to be a writer? Was it from a very young age?
It was funny. I had a journal when I was little and I began to try to write stories. I think I always had a kind of a desire and an impetus to write. And like so many, I think people want to become writers, it's a vague, unlinear path in life. And you feel this urge to kind of express yourself. And so I wrote all sorts of different ways at trying to find the kind of right medium over years. I mean, it took me years and years to figure out kind of writing I was best suited for and wanted to do. Ironically, my mom in many ways always discouraged me from being a writer.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, in a loving way, she just thought it was a really hard life. And I think like very, nervous, overprotective mothers, she worried, how do you survive and make a living? And she just thought it was a hard life. So
yes, this sounds like a very familiar conversation. I had the same one with my mother.
Yeah, and I always tease her. I say I always became a writer just to spite her.
Right. I think my mother's always like, why did you get in the publishing end? That's where the money is.
Yeah.
So you were writing all through high school, and then you went to Connecticut College. You were always a really good student. I think you were always like number one in our class. I'll just let that little secret out of the bag. You were like so smart. I do remember that.
It made up for all the years when I flunked out of high school. That was all.
Yeah, I never understood that because you were so smart in college, and you always said that you were didn't do that in high school. But after college, you didn't at that point know that you wanted to be a writer. I remember this is after Connecticut College. I remember hearing that you had gone to Mexico.
Yeah, I went to Mexico. I had a Thomas Watson Fellowship.
What's that?
It's a really cool thing. It's in some ways like a Fulbright, except it's you structure your own program. So it could be, it's whatever you kind of design your program for a year. And the projects are so variety and so creative, and it attracts poets and adventurers and historians, writers, archaeologists, whatever it may be in your project. My project was to do a lot of kind of anthropological and political research involving families in Mexico from different kind of economic and sociological sectors during the time that the one-party rule in Mexico was ending. That was kind of the project I designed. But interestingly enough, I spent a lot of time there writing, and the project involved a fair amount of writing. And I got my first newspaper clips when I was there. There was a English magazine that was published by a newspaper called La Jornada. It actually has a pretty interesting history, which was Pete Hamill, I guess, had been in Mexico at some point.
Oh, wow.
Very famous, legendary journalist.
With the Daily News and writing.
Yeah, with the Daily News, or it's written great books, great novels. At some point, they had been at one he had a lot of young people there, and they had all walked out when there was some censorship, and a lot of the young people had started this other publication that was then put out by La Jornada, which was a Mexican newspaper, a little English magazine. And they, I went to meet with them, and they said, we'll take your look at your clips on spec. And so I lived pretty far outside Mexico City. I lived in a place called Puebla. It was a couple of hours from Mexico City by bus. And, once a month I would get on the bus. I would do some kind of political reporting or local reporting. Nothing so significant. I can barely remember what they might have been about.
Right.
And I would, but the more interesting part was just the mechanics of it all, because, there were no fax and there was no internet. So I used to get on the bus, and I remember I would type up the stories, and then I would hand deliver them.
Oh my God.
And I would look at them, and if they liked them, I would ride into Mexico City. If they liked them, they'd pay me a couple bucks. I mean, when I say a couple bucks, I mean a couple bucks. And it would be just enough basically to let me buy go to a movie and get some English, which I was always happy because I never got to speak English when I was in Puebla, and then ride the bus back. But those were my first real clips, professional first clips I was paid for.
Oh, my goodness. And then you ended up going to an international relations school, right, to get your degree?
Yes.
That sounds like your mother's doing.
Well, no, you're so on, but well, it was my way of basically forestalling the parental plan. The parental plan at that point was, what the hell is he doing with his life? At that point, I was in Mexico. I was trying to write on the side. I had taught some school. I was trying to write stories on the side. Was really not earning a living. And, they're like, you got to get a career. I didn't want to be a doctor. My dad was a doctor. I'm too squeamish, so I never had any interest in medicine or science. So, law school was the other kind of normal option. And so I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy because it had law in the title.
That would stave her off, yeah.
But it wasn't a law school. It was just basically a master's program in IR. But I suppose, I still came from some interest of wanting to still be a reporter. And at that point, I had interest in being a foreign reporter or a foreign correspondent. And so it gave me that background. Again, the challenge with all these things is, how the hell do you start, and how do you get anyone to hire you? And but that's where it kind of came from.
Right About Now is brought to you by AG1 by Athletic Greens. AG1, that's my go-to power drink of the day. Seriously, every scoop of AG1 is packed with 75 vitamins, minerals, whole food sourced ingredients. And the best part is that it tastes really good. I have 2 green drinks a day, put some Athletic Greens in there, and I definitely feel more energized. I drink with water or I drop it in my smoothie. Sometimes I live on the edge and I do both. My only complaint about this product is that my 14-year-old daughter keeps breaking into my AG1 stash, and I'm halfway out of my supply every month. AG1, if you're listening, I need some more greens. Right About Now has a special deal with Athletic Greens going on right now. So what you got to do is you go to athleticgreens.com/rightaboutnow. That's athleticgreens.com/right, WRITE, about now, and you will get a year's free supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Enjoy. You raise an interesting point, and that is, my parents always said, have a backup plan. Like, if you want to do a creative job, at least have a backup plan. And they didn't enforce that, and I just ended up going right. I didn't go to any schools after college. I just went right into the workforce. And, now that I have kids and they're very interested in creative pursuits, I'm always wondering, you always have that in your back pocket if the writing thing didn't work out. I mean, would that be advice that you would give to creative people?
Gosh, I'm never so confident to give any advice to anybody on any.
I'm going to ask for you for advice this entire interview.
In terms of like projects of writing and how to write a story, I feel like I've been doing that enough. I probably have something to say. But in terms of paths and stuff, I found it so tricky. And mine was so meandering and nonlinear. And I don't know if there's a backup plan. I mean, I always just say, pursue the thing you love, and then hopefully it will work out. Yeah. And then, it's interesting, like in my career or path, financial constraints in many ways influence decision making. It wasn't like I was in some abstract laboratory where I was just able to pursue any kind of path I wanted.
How so? What did you do after Fletcher?
I had a teaching fellowship after that at BU in creative writing for 1 year. It was a teaching fellowship, and that was kind of great. That was great. And I got to teach college, which I loved. I taught for a year before that, a couple years earlier, 7th and 8th grade, I was so ill-suited for. I had this lovely head of hair, as you might remember, and by the time I was done teaching, it was all gone. I mean,
I do remember your hair quite a bit.
Now I'm going to have a bunch of teenagers, and my God, my visions of my class are coming back to haunt me. But then when I finished that, I just basically needed, some kind of paying writing job. And there was a new newspaper in Washington, D.C. that was starting up called The Hill. And I didn't know anything really about it. And, there wasn't really anything to know about it because it wasn't even published yet. And I heard about it, I went down for an interview. And it was funny, they ended up hiring me as a copy editor. I thought they were hiring me as an editor, but somehow there was some miscommunication in the interview. When I got down there, it turned out I was a copy editor, which also had a great deal of irony in it because I have a very poor eyesight condition. And so I actually have really trouble reading. And I'm also really bad at grammar. How did you get that job? it's a constant lifelong challenge. If you ask me the rules of grammar, I'm kind of just bewildered by it. So in any case, I was a copy editor. I probably did a really bad job.
So they had a copy editor with eye problems. It was terrible at grammar, but
100%. And but like any great startup, I mean, I think that's like the nature of startups. And then, it was kind of chaos and it was great. And like within a year, I was the executive editor.
Now, The Hill is a newspaper, or now probably a website, which focuses on the goings of the Hill, the Capitol Hill, right?
Yep. And that's what I mean by financial constraints. Like, so did I want to report on Congress? Not particularly. I mean, I did not want to report on it. I mean, I didn't have any antipathy toward it, but it wouldn't have been, the thing I was burning to get to DC and be a political reporter and certainly cover Capitol Hill wasn't. But that was the place that hired me and where I ended up. And then, of course, people for years after that would always think of me as a political reporter. It took me years and years to get people to finally give me assignments that weren't just political.
Yeah, it's hard not to get pigeonholed.
Yeah, I got pigeonholed. Everyone was just like, give me a Capitol Hill piece.
And what did you learn at the Hill? Did it teach you some basic skills that you still use to this day?
It did, because I had none. It did. I mean, it taught me so many, and often through error. I had taken that Blanche Boyd class. It wasn't a kind of nuts and bolts course on how to do journalism, or it was more teaching how to write, how to think, kind of exposure to literary journalism. I had no formal training whatsoever. And things that other people probably, certainly we were all young, but the bosses and the higher editors weren't. But, it was a bunch of young, wonderful people. Everyone who's kind of gone on to wonderful careers.
Who are some of the people that were there?
Jen Senior, who ran a wonderful book and the book critic for the New York Times. And now she's written lots of features for New York Magazine and New York Times. Craig Carman was there, who went on to the Wall Street Journal. Sarah Pekkanen, who became a novelist.
Right. So it was young all-stars.
The group, I mean, it had that kind of wonderful madness of stars where we were all just, what the hell are we doing? And kind of being overwhelmed.
Now, was it kind of a house of cards situation where you had to have relationships with different Congress people to, break scoops and get inside tracks?
Yes. I was never a big scoop person, sadly. I wasn't so good at that. Partly I had a lot of editing positions at the publication. So, I edited a lot of people, but I did write, and I had like a column, which I did, but that was never my great strength. I still remember, I think it was my first day at the Hill, or second day or third day. When we first showed up, we didn't even have guests. And then I remember we, got our passes to go to Congress. And so we all went to Congress, and I showed up, and we went to the House. I discovered the House is a much more fun place to cover than the Senate. The access is much easier. You can pull the 420 member of Congress is desperate for some conversation with a reporter. There was this thing you could do. You would go to the House side, and you could do it on the Senate side too. And you would give in a little request when the members were on the floor voting, and you could ask for them to come off to see you. And they often would say yes. Sometimes they would say no. And I had put in for Barney Frank. I don't remember why or what the story was. Something was happening that made me want to speak to him. And I remember waiting really nervously. There was somebody else who put in his name in front of me. So he was talking to Congressman Frank. And then I was waiting very nervously. It was going to be my first time speaking to a congressperson. And I remember there was a reporter from the New York Times, who will remain nameless, who came and stepped in front of me and just kind of Bigfooted me. And then I remember Congressman Frank, when he had finished with the other person and he looked up to see who was next, he put his hand out to push the New York Times reporter out of the way and came to me because he knew I had been waiting. And that always had a soft spot for me, for that congressperson.
That's awesome.
But I still remember that. It was a very vivid moment, but I just remember such a newbie.
Yeah, it's such a newbie. But Barney Frank, he saw talent early on. He knew. So you went to the New Republic, and there might have been other stops along the way, but I do remember when you were at the New Republic, and that was a big job for you.
Yes, I was always much more naturally drawn to magazines or longer stories. In fact, when I was at the Hill newspaper, I would always write these stories, and I would kind of tell them the way, my grandmother used to tell me stories when I was growing up. And she would tell me stories about my grandfather, who had this kind of amazing life, fled from Russia across Europe, just he was a furrier. He was a photographer, National Geographic, very early on. And he had a stroke, and he would sit on our deck. He really couldn't move, but she would tell me these amazing stories about him. So, and those were the way I always thought about stories, which had these kind of narrative arcs, and they kind of had a beginning and a middle and an end. And so when I, became a reporter and I was at the Hill, I would always kind of tell stories kind of from beginning, middle to end. And, I would turn them in like, yeah, this is really good, but let's take your last graph. Let's move that to your, to the very top. And you have to have a nut graph, but you kind of had to give the story away. And so I knew already that form, in a way, was not the best suited for me. I wanted to get to magazines, and then Mike Kelly had become editor at the New Republic, and I had thought of him as kind of a wonderful long-form journalist. He sadly died in Iraq, but really was a remarkable narrative nonfiction writer. People think of him more for his columns, but he wrote a wonderful book about the first Iraq War. And so he hired me. And then, of course, he was fired within a few months, which is the general history of the New Republic.
Now, is Michael Kelly the one who was immortalized in Shattered Glass, the movie Shattered Glass?
He was in Shattered Glass, yes.
Yes.
And Steve was a colleague of mine at the New Republic.
Right, which you probably can't talk about, but that was...
I don't give a shit. I hate the guy.
Yeah.
I'm sure has a decent side to him, and maybe he's changed. And, I'm a big believer in rehabilitation, but...
For our listeners who might not know what we're talking about. So,
sure.
So Stephen Glass was a journalist with the New Republic who fabricated many stories.
Dozens. I don't remember how many, and not just for the New Republic. And again, my memory is foggy on this, but many publications, major magazines. I think he had pieces in that later were turned out. I remember George, and again, I want to be careful because I don't remember all. No. But there were many publications. He had, he was just what we would call in the business a total piper, and he would just pipe shit left and right. But, I considered him a friend at the time. I mean, he was a colleague. We weren't buddies or anything, but I considered him a colleague. He had a very friendly, likable personality. But there was I think for anyone who's ever been conned, I write about a lot of con.
You do. Artists. That's interesting. I didn't never made that connection. I wonder if it was planted there.
I've always been interested in that act of betrayal of people who kind of create and fabricate worlds until you've been the victim of one directly, which in retrospect, they always seem so painfully obvious. I mean, when people look back on cons and they're not part of the cons, they're always like, how did the widow, why did she give them the house and the will and all the money, and they always look so obvious in retrospect. But when you're in the middle of them, the thing that makes a con person a con effective is they play on some weakness or vulnerability, and you kind of trust them, you believe them. And we as humans tend to believe people. I mean, especially when they're friends, you're not thinking that like when you go to work, you go to a store, or you in your daily encounters that someone is kind of actively deceiving you. Your brain just doesn't function that way. And if it did function that way, it'd be a really sad way to go through life. So, but it leaves you very vulnerable to this. And not just me, it was less me. It was more watching the betrayal that he did to so many people who he was much closer to. That's a wound that is hard to heal. And if he's changed and gone on to good life, God bless him. But it's not an easy subject for me. I
can understand that. And for those who want to find out more about it, just go see the movie Shattered Glass. There's probably some good books about it too. I don't know, but I did see Shattered Glass.
There was a good piece in Vanity Fair with Shattered Glass was about by Buzz Bissinger. And then the movie as well.
So let's move on from Mr. Glass. But at the New Republic, were you writing and editing?
I did early on some editing, and then I moved just to writing.
And what kind of things were you writing? That's when you started getting more into the long form stories, correct?
Yeah, so I got more into long form. I mean, again, I was a little bit pigeonholed as the political reporter, especially Capitol Hill. So I did a lot of Congress stuff. I mean, it was actually a pretty exciting time in retrospect to be covering Congress. And it felt that way in the first couple of years because I got to Congress in 1993. And what they called the Republican Revolution back then, which was the rise of Newt Gingrich, was 1994.
Contract with America.
And in many ways, the seeds of what is happening today in Washington, the Republican Party, I think, when historians go back and kind of try to explain Trump, I think they'll look at Newt Gingrich as the kind of origin point in many ways of the direction of the party. But so that was all happening at the time. And Bill Clinton was president. And then was impeached. I still have a memory of covering impeachment. And I remember showing up at the Senate and Strom Thurmond, the senator from South Carolina. He must have been, I mean, the Senate's like the last place in the world, I guess maybe the Supreme Court, where you just basically die in your boots in the job. And,
or don't get fired for sexually harassing
or,
people.
yeah, or yes, right. if you don't get voted out. So, but I remember he was so old, and I remember I showed up and he thought I was his aide. And I remember taking Strom Thurmond to the bathroom. I have a very vivid memory.
Oh my God.
I escorted him. He was very confused. And then I brought him back out. I waited for him to pee, and then I let him back out. And his aides were looking around petrified. And I turned them over to him. I said, I think you're looking for your senator.
Oh my God, this is a person passing legislation.
Well, this was a person voting on impeachment, too.
Yeah.
So in any case, but, there was a kind of I don't want to say transformative moment, but there was a moment that was kind of pivotal in kind of exposing me to the kind of stories I would love to do. And it happened when I was at the New Republic, which is I was doing a lot of these kind of Capitol Hill stories that kind of interested me less. And then I did a story about a congressman named Trafficant. People probably don't remember him, but he was a congressman from Ohio who had this crazy hair that turned out to be a toupee. We didn't know it was a toupee until he went to prison, and they had to remove it, and we saw a mug shot. But he was a crooked, corrupt congressman from Mahoning, Ohio. And there was a story that the feds were investigating him for alleged corruption. And I went out there, and it turned out that before he had been elected to Congress, he had been a sheriff in Ohio, or he was running for sheriff in Ohio. And he had been caught up with these mobsters who were Lenny the Crab and Orly the Crab, if my memory serves me correct.
It's awesome.
And, yeah, the names were great. This was an area where the mob and the violence was notoriously bad. And it was basically a mob-run town from top to bottom. And one of the mobsters was recording him when he was talking about basically taking bribes or allegedly taking bribes from various groups of the mob and what he was going to do with the money. And I found a transcript of this mob. It was actually made by apparently one of the mobsters who then disappeared. I think Lenny the Crab disappeared and was never seen again, if my memory serves me. And I got this transcript, and here was Congressman Trafficant, who was always known as the honorable gentleman from Ohio, as they would say on the House floor. And he's talking on this thing, for every other word is a curse. He's talking about people coming up swimming dead in the Mahoning River.
Wow.
And I was listening to this voice, and it was such a disconnect from the voice one heard in Capitol Hill. And I thought, this had such a real authenticity to it, not the badness, it's a virtue, but just the voice. And there was such a disconnect from the voice you were hearing of the person and then the presentation of the person on the floor of the House and the way that person was perceived. And I thought, that is the kind of voice I want to get to. I want to try to get to that more authentic voice of people. And that story really kind of pushed me in a way to really try to get away from politics in some ways. I still did politics, but I didn't love politics enough to dig deep enough to always to get that authentic voice. But the kind of story I wanted, whether it was political or social or criminal or scientific, I wanted to get that kind of voice that was hard to get and hard to find.
Yeah, I don't know if you could ever find that authentic voice in Washington.
And there are people who do it well. I mean, but you have to love it. I mean, the Woodwards of the world. I mean, there's so much great political reporting.
Yeah, they get people to open up to them and actually be.
They get people to open up, but they love it so much. They're willing to put up with so much BS. And it's also why I stay away from certain athletes. If LeBron James would let me hang around with him for, in authentic moments, that would be wonderful. But so many stars and like that, you end up going through a phalanx of press people and spokespeople.
They're so guarded.
So guarded. It's so managed. And, it's why I don't tend to do actors. They'll say, you have an hour at some hotel. Well, that's not, I don't want to sit with someone at a hotel to do a story.
Yeah, it's really challenging. Believe me, I've done it many times.
Yeah.
So now you're starting to find your voice, or at least starting to find the kinds of stories that you're more interested in writing, and they're, more authentic characters and people. Were there steps in between the Republic and New Yorker? Yeah,
there was, in the sense that I met my lovely wife who you met in New York.
She's lovely.
She was a journalist too, and she was a producer. At that time, she was producer at 60 Minutes at CBS. So she lived in New York, and I remember, I think the last campaign I covered was part of Hillary's Senate campaign. And I was like, that's it for me. I'm out.
Yeah. Talk
I
about
can't do-
inauthentic.
I was just like, I'm out. And in the early Senate campaign, I think even more so than her latter stuff, because she was so new and so guarded at that point. And it was her part of her listening tour. And I just remembered it was just not for me. And so, and then I basically decided to go freelance. And my wife was, my fiance then became a fiance and wife soon after, but, encouraged me and really supported me for a few years while I tried to do these other kind of stories.
And she ended up helping you edit, right? She edits.
Well, she's a great editor. She's such a great journalist. She's amazing. Yeah. And so supportive, and also just a great editor, just a great sense of story. She really has as good a sense of story as anyone I know.
That's so great. What a good secret weapon that you have there. Behind every great man. So now let's fast forward to the New Yorker. Did you start writing for them and then get a staff position? Is that how it worked?
It was funny. I was so nervous about the New Yorker because it was always the pinnacle for me and for the kind of story I wanted to do. And I had actually heard many years earlier that David Remnick, liked some of my stuff. And I think it took me like another 5 years after that to work up the courage to still pitch a piece.
Right.
And then I finally pitched a piece, and I did 2 pieces for them. My first piece was called Old Man and the Gun. It was about an old bank robber and it was about an old stick-up artist, kind of the last of the great legendary stick-up artists, and going all the way back almost to the Depression era. And it probably is the greatest prison escape artist in American
I remember
history.
when you were writing that story. I remember you called me because I had done some prison escape story for Stuff Magazine at the time, and you called me to ask me about that.
Remember that? Yes. Yeah, the guy broke out of San Quentin and he built a little boat in the shop, and then he painted on a rub-a-dub-dub, and he literally escaped in a little boat off of San Quentin. He also, it was funny because he told me this story. You always check this stuff out, and you think, half of it's got to be BS. He said when I finally was interviewing, he told me how he had broken out of Alcatraz. I said, well, no one's broken out of Alcatraz. But then he told me the story, and he's actually in some ways technically true. I mean, there's a story about the famous movie, I think assuredly died drowning trying to break out. The way he did it, which was why it's less famous, but why it actually at least succeeded for a short period, was he faked being sick, got taken off the island, was then put into a prison hospital off the island, and then broke out of the hospital, and he was on the lam for a good few hours.
That's amazing. I've always been curious how you find your stories, because you have the best stories. And we're going to get into this because you're an obsessive researcher. I know that. But is it just reading, especially even this is like pre-internet, some of these things, right? So you're not even like online necessarily.
It in some ways, it's just the same processes I think that most go through. But I think it's the hardest part. And I think it comes to some degree out of insecurity. I mean, you think if I have an okay story, then, I can only flop so much if the story is good enough. But I read newspapers, local newspapers, there's less of them. An interesting story, just to use Old Man and the Gun, is also sometimes just patience. That was a story that he tried to rob a bank, and I think he was like age 70 something. He tried to rob a bank, and then he had like a car chase and crashed. And he had a hearing aid in the bank that turned out to be a police scanner. And but when that happened, everybody actually wanted to get him. He was and I saw that story in the New York Post. And then I knew at the time that, because Kira worked at 60, I knew 60 Minutes was chasing him, and I tried to get him, and lots of people tried to get him. And he said, no, I presumed all of them. He said no to me. His lawyer did. And every couple months, I would just send a letter. Mm-hmm. And they said no every time. And another 4 months, then maybe a year would go by. And 2 years later, I was like, oh, what the hell? I'll send another letter. And by that time, all his appeals had expired. And he was basically knew he was going to rot away and probably die in jail. And he said, why, come meet me.
Wow. So the lesson there is just don't give up, perseverance. You never know. It's luck, a little bit of luck, because it's good timing.
A little bit of luck, and I think we tend to move in packs. So that's a story where there could have been a pack story, and then people just moved on and forgot about them, which I think we forget a lot of people. There's kind of a moment of electricity, and then it disappears. Other stories are often like briefs in newspapers. I try to kind of randomly talk to people who I think are smart and just just have conversations with them and hopefully they lead to something. I wish it was more scientific because it isn't. And in some ways, part of the process is just saying no to so many stories or looking into so many stories until you kind of settle on one. And so there's a lot of frenetic, kind of stressful early periods where you're just researching lots of different stories, figuring out, well, this turns out not to be as interesting as I thought. Oh, I would love to do the story, but nobody will talk. Or
is there like a checklist in your head that you sort of go through that a story has to sort of meet these certain requirements? I mean, is it just a gut check that you do within yourself? Like, that is an interesting story, and then you kind of pursue it?
Yeah, I suppose it's a combination. I think probably at some fundamental level, there is an instinctual reaction, which is the same way when you just hear something or someone tells you a story and you just kind of sit up, if you're at a dinner table and someone starts telling you a story, you probably hear a million conversations where your attention is one and then you hear one and you just instinctually sit up. And then I think you do go through an intellectual process. You almost kind of like reverse engineer it in a way to try to evaluate it. And then when you're evaluating it, I do look for certain things. I'm looking for, obviously, is it of some interest, some kind of intrigue to it? Is there a human being or a group of human beings involved that themselves hopefully are interesting or have something to say? Is there a subculture perhaps it takes you into?
That's interesting.
In other words, there's a kind of a milieu that the story takes place in that in itself is interesting. So I've written about, sandhogs building tunnels underneath, New York, thousands of feet. I've written about a prison gang, the Aryan Brother, and how they took over prison. So you're getting into the subculture of prisons, how that works. And then I think the kind of the last part of that is, does it have hopefully some larger meaning or import? And that can vary. I mean, I think for a book, that question is far more important. I think for a magazine, it could be a little bit less, but still you want a story that hopefully gets at something larger. And it can be character driven. It doesn't need to be some, larger comment about the whole world or, global warming. It can be, with Old Man and the Gun. I mean, in the end, it really was just a deep character portrait of this person and coming to terms with the kind of life he lived and the decisions he made along the way, and looking back on his life and trying to assess it and make peace with it and the regrets he had about that. And so it had a kind of a wistfulness amid all the kind of wonderful mania of, breaking out of prison and excitement and the romance of it.
And it almost seems like there has to be some sort of transformation within your character, right? Some sort of something they learned or some sort of evolution in an arc, as we like to say in Hollywood.
Yes. And I would say that there's that early process where you kind of try to figure out things. But all you really figure out at a certain point is like, okay, this seems interesting enough. The person's agreed to speak to me. I had an interview with him. He seems pretty interesting. But at a certain point, you just kind of roll the dice and you don't know where the story will turn out. Often the notions that I've conceived in my head don't turn out and things take far more interesting turns than I expected. But you have to kind of be alert to that. And I think, as a writer and reporter and as someone who's written about wrongful convictions and investigators who get tunnel vision, I'm sure I get tunnel vision too, being aware of that and being kind of as best you can. We're all fallible. And I've become far more humble as I've gotten older about the processes of knowledge, of reporting, of what we can learn, of what we can access, how much we can know, how definitive we can know things. But you have to be kind of nimble about that. I'll just give a big example, kind of a funny example. I did a story on the search for the giant squid. That was one where I heard about. So, I mean, I'll walk you through that story a little bit because I think it illuminates the process. So I was kind of desperate to find a story. I was still very new at the New Yorker. I was a little bit behind on my contract. I just had a little boy. And so I was frantically trying to find one. I was speaking to a friend who made a joke. Well, why don't you do something about the giant squid? And I said, well, what about the giant squid? He said, well, don't you know, they've never found one. And I said, what? And then I looked it up and sure enough, the giant squid, which is this kind of amazing, seems like a mythical creature, which has eyes the size of tires on a tractor trailer and has these tentacles that can stretch as long as a school bus or longer. That there was once one stretched like 60 feet, but no one had ever seen one alive, at least at the time when I was working on the story. They knew they existed because dead ones had floated to the surface. Or they would find them in the gut of some sperm whales. And you could see them. They show up in Moby Dick. And so they kind of populated literature. So it's kind of this wonderful creature. But I thought, well, how the hell will you tell that story? There's nothing to see. And what would you do? And so I did more research. And I found out that, well, there are these giant squid hunters. And they've spent their lives trying to be the first to find the giant squid. And they have all these crazy techniques. They would like harpoon, a sperm whale.
And there's your subculture, right?
Yeah, there was the subculture and these crazy marine biologists. They would go down in cages and they had all these techniques. And then you go, well, who could I follow? And then I found this wonderful person in New Zealand, a guy named Steve O'Shea, his marine biologist, kind of spent his whole life. He had this kind of crazy theory about he would capture a baby giant squid and then he would grow it in captivity. The reason is that, like a lot of marine creatures, they hatch many babies, so it'd be easier to catch one and they wouldn't be able to swim as fast, and you could catch one. It had all sorts of weird wrinkles to it, which I won't get into because it's really hard to actually grow a giant squid. There's a reason why you've actually seen a squid in an aquarium, because they can't actually hold them in cases. They tend to just kind of swim into the walls and kill themselves. So, So I found out he was going to go out. And so I went to David Remnick at the New Yorker and the editor there. And I said, I have this idea. And I did that thing that a lot of reporters do, which is I oversold the story.
Uh-oh.
I said, look, man, we're going to make history. And I was pretty nervous. I was still new at the magazine. I said, we're going to make history. I'll be the first. We're going to capture this thing. I'm going to go out with him to New Zealand. Capture it. We'll be the magazine. We can break news. And so he said, okay, great. So I went down. Now, even in those days that were more heady than these days, it was really expensive to fly a reporter to New Zealand to chase a giant squid, of all things.
Right.
And so I got there and I met him. And, it turned out he really was bankrupt. He didn't have any money. He kind of lost all his money chasing his squid. And he only had a little skiff. Oh. And it turned out there was a typhoon. And so I said, well, we'll just wait out the typhoon. And he said, well, actually, we have to go now because the giant squid only hatch during certain seasons and they'll miss. In any case, we go out in this little boat and you can only chase a giant squid apparently at night because that's when they rise in the water column. I don't know. In any case, we go out and the trip was a total disaster in the sense of we don't catch it. We're in this typhoon in this skiff. At some point, I thought the captain might be mad. There was only me, him, and his grad student who got seasick. And we would work from basically 6 p.m. until 5 a.m. until sunrise. He put me to work because he didn't have any crew. And so we would put these nets and we would just pull them in. And on the 5th or 6th night of this, of just being bleary-eyed in these just crazy seas, I mean, there were 30, 40-foot waves. We were in like a 16-foot boat, I think. And we were pulling up the tank and we thought we saw the baby giant squid. And the grad student said, there's your dream squid. And we had to transfer it to another tank. And we were transferring it to the other tank. And then suddenly it disappeared.
Whoa.
To the point where I wasn't sure if it had even existed. Was it just in our tiredness an illusion? I think it did exist, but in the waves we had lost it. And my poor marine biologist who I was with, his face, I mean, he just collapsed. I've never seen such despair in my life. Oh. And all I kept thinking, though, in that moment was, I'm dead. I am personally dead. My career is over. I pitched this story to the New Yorker. We had it and then we lost it, maybe, I think.
You might have dreamt it. Yeah.
I might have dreamt it. And, I've been out here for 3 weeks and I've got nothing to come back with. And I really was worried. And because I had this preconceived notion of the story that we would find this thing and grow it and have this fairy tale ending. And then, of course, it was only a day or so later that as I thought more about the moment, that I realized that moment was so much more true and revealing because it really was about this man who had sacrificed everything in his obsession, in his mono obsession. He really was an Ahab-like character. And here, after years and years and years, he had it within his grasp and he lost it. And in a way that was so much more powerfully emotionally and so much truer, obviously, to both reality and to the story and to this man. But it took me a while to recognize that because I just was looking at the crumbling narrative originally.
Right. Well, you had gone in with sort of the story written in your head a little bit, right? And then it completely...
Yeah, you have some notion of what it will be, right? Well, we're going to catch and chase a giant squid. Well, we better catch it, right? You don't think, well, we won't catch it because then why would you go?
Exactly.
Lives have an arc. And so that's why I say you can only know a story so much. So you do the research, you do the preliminary stuff, and then you basically just strap on and hold on for life.
But I think what makes, what separates you and other great writers from the pack is that you can recognize when a story might be going a different direction. You can sort of recognize what the story is, right?
You have to be open to it. And often it's far more interesting because if you can already think of it, what it is, it's probably more predictable and less interesting. Life, it really goes according to plan. And if you've already conceived of something in your head, it's probably not that interesting, or it's less interesting. But it's how to kind of figure it out and make sense of it. And that scene that originally I thought, I didn't even know what to do with it. Like, did we have it? Didn't we? How would you even write that scene originally? I was like, that can't even be in the piece. It's not even like, what was that? I don't even know what that was. Instead, it became this kind of the pivotal moment in the piece, and for obvious reasons in retrospect. But it took a while to notice, and that's happened many times. And you have to do your best to hopefully be open. I'm sure I'm not always, but you want to be. And life, I mean, it's the difference in nonfiction. It's both the challenges and the pleasures. The pleasures are, it really can be surprising and unexpected. I mean, the challenges are, you're stuck with what you got. You've got a mess. Well, what is that mess? And maybe that mess is far more interesting. Maybe that mess actually contains a great deal of beauty.
Beauty and chaos.
Yes.
So you eventually, I think in 2003, you became a staff writer for The New Yorker.
Yes.
What does a staff writer at The New Yorker do? I mean, how does it work there? Like, did you have to produce a certain amount of stories a year?
Yeah, I think everybody's a little bit different there. And it's funny, I feel like I should know better. But the great thing, I could say this, I could speak for myself, at least with David, with Remnick, and what makes him a great writer. And I have a personal editor there too, who's I should just single out because I just think he's one of the greatest editors I've ever worked with. A guy named Daniel Zaleski, and he's just he's probably edited more writers if you went through them who his hidden fingerprints are on. But when I got to the magazine, I had not yet really totally found my way in the kind of stories I wanted to do, and just like anywhere else, they're like, well, can you do a political story for us and go for not Capitol Hill? But that was kind of what I had done, and but they eventually kind of saw, I think almost collectively kind of figured out, well, I do this a certain kind of story, and let's nurture that. And then, but I think every writer is different, because you might have a staff writer who is, on the covers Washington and is on the political beat. You may have one who is more designated a foreign correspondent. You may have one who does more kind of purely like Elizabeth Culver, more environmental.
How did you describe your type of story that you do?
Oh, God.
It's hard.
I would never, I heard the best term, and it actually came from Daniel, but it was actually another writer of his I saw yesterday who mentioned that this is what he referred to them as. And I had never heard him use this term before, but I kind of love it. He said investigative melodramas.
That's good.
I can't take credit for it, but I was like, investigative melodramas. And
that's kind of your thing.
It's a great thing, because I do a fair amount of investigative work, because they are fairly intensive, and I can spend anywhere between 3 months even to a year on a story, depending on what it is.
And they allow you to do that at The New Yorker.
They do. I mean, it's not a great way to make a living, but yes, they do that.
Because are you paid by the sort of?
Yeah, you have to produce a certain amount of work each year,
right?
And each person is different. So I have a certain amount of work I need to generate. So being slow is never really in one
economically a good. Yeah.
Yes, it's not economically advantageous.
So it's not like you're getting paid a yearly wage. It's really kind of a. No, I mean, again, everybody's different. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody's different. So you have to generate a certain number of stories a year.
Got it.
And so for me, especially in my early years, I did focus more on books a lot now, so it's much less. But in those early days, I would do 3 or 4 pieces a year, and they would take usually it would vary, but I 3 or 4, and they would be about anywhere between about 10,000 and 15,000 words usually.
Wow.
It's funny because we all now, with long form and what it means. But, I mean, I think, writing short is really hard too. There's certain writing I'm just not good at, and you kind of recognize that. Like, I always wanted to do an op-ed for the New York Times. It was like my dream. And I was still I had a fair amount of success in life, but I was still trying to get op-eds in the New York Times, and they'd always turn them back in. They say, this is really good, but it's just too reported.
Right. Wasn't enough opinion.
I mean, I have an opinion. It's like, okay. But my wife would just like, give it up, finally, give it up.
Just give it up.
Like, there are just people like who can just do these songs like that. They're just like these gems, and they're just beautiful. And they're like these just little short, almost prose poems. And like, I'm almost like, I just don't know how to do that. I mean,
Oh, those are so hard. And they're in a very much of a specific voice too, right?
their voice, and it's just like one scene, and it's just real. So it's like whatever you're good at, the other thing seems really challenging and forbidding. So for me, like A Talk of the Town, I've never had one. I tried to do one for the New Yorker, and it got killed because the Washington Post ended up doing a story before it came out. But even that, it wasn't that good, and it was like such a challenge to be done.
So you write this story about the lost world of Z. And I think the story came first, right? And then the book came later. Is that?
Yes. Yep, that's right.
You write this amazing story where you are retracing the path of Commander Percy Fawcett. And I remember reading the story actually when it first came out. How did it become a book?
So at that point, I was under contract actually with a publisher to do a book. But when we eventually found what the subject would be, and I kind of kicked around for a couple of years without finding one. There were a few that were close, and it was funny. This was the first piece for the magazine where I finished it, and the piece was really long. I think that piece was like 20,000 words, but it was the first piece where I finished. Normally, when I finish a piece at the New Yorker, they're so exhaustive. I don't ever want to return to the material again. I'm done with it, and this was the first time where I just felt like there were still so many places to go and kind of questions I had. He was kind of this crazy, interesting explorer who, for the listeners are familiar, who basically mapped a lot of the interior of the Amazon and then began to believe there was an ancient civilization in the middle of the jungle, which kind of defied conventional theories about whether there could be an ancient civilization in the Amazon. And he set off in 1925 to find. He went with his older son and his son's friend, and then they disappeared, and it kind of launched all this folklore. And there were kind of two central questions about him. One was the mystery of kind of what had happened to him and his companions, his son. And then this larger question of, could there really be an ancient civilization in the jungle, this place that he had called the City of Z? And the piece in the magazine really focused on me tracing his route and what I could learn. It was much more in the present. But I had begun to accumulate a lot of documents, including his diaries, which were almost impossible to read. It would take me years to finally, to fully digest. So small and washed out and just magnifying glass and just take a long time.
Did you hire like a handwriting expert to help?
No, I just did it myself, but you'd have to decode them, and it was more just took a long time he could write clearly enough. He just wrote really small and diaries were really old, and the diaries had been in the jungle, so they were, washed out. So the book, there was so much about him. And so, it was interesting. The magazine story was really about, 70% or 70% kind of my journey,
right,
and about 30% him. And the book really was the flip. It was about 70% about him and 30% my journey, or something. I'm making those ratios up, but.
And that's interesting. And then when they ended up making a movie, they didn't put your journey in there at all, which made me mad.
They couldn't find anyone handsome enough to play me. There was Brad Pitt he couldn't even play me.
It's very hard to play you. Yeah, you're
very, very hard. I guess I don't know. I always thought Paul Giamatti would have made a good version of me in the jungle.
He would have been good. So let me just tell you that just thinking about it makes me have the heebie-jeebies, and because I'm terrified of insects, and I know it wasn't as bad when you went as it was during Colonel Fawcett's time, when people were literally getting eaten alive by bugs.
Yes. But
you had some crazy adventures. Can you maybe recount one of them, in the Amazon there when you were? Yeah,
I mean, the jungle, and, during Fawcett's day, I mean, because they had no immunities for diseases, I mean, these parties would just go in and they would just die one after the other. I mean, Fawcett would go, usually with small parties of about a dozen people, and usually because he did many expeditions before the final kind of climactic one where he disappeared. But before that, half his men would die. We described burying them by the sides of the river. Men would starve. They would die yellow fever, malaria. When I went, thankfully, I had immunities. But it was still pretty hairy, and it was particularly hairy for me just because I'm out of shape and I don't hunt, and I like my Chinese food delivered, and I'm the last person.
You're a
ever to
Jew
be-
from Westport, Connecticut. Yes,
exactly. I'm the last person to ever be in the jungle. I mean, when I say I don't camp, I don't camp. Like I mean, maybe when I was little, I think maybe I did a Boy Scout trip once, but I mean, I don't camp. I mean, I don't like to camp, but I don't camp.
and you don't like snakes, apparently.
Oh God, I'm so phobic of snakes. Can't stand them. To this day, I can't stand them. I mean, if I literally had seen an anaconda, I think it would have been the end of me. So, but in any case, I got there, and I would say that the hairiest moment was a moment where I got separated from my guide.
Mm-hmm.
And well, this is how ridiculous I am. I had brought my laptop computer with me. Now, I to my defense, I was not bringing it thinking I would use it in the jungle. But, I had a long period of time where I had to go to like Rio and then to Sao Paulo and then to other places. So I thought I would need my laptop. So, but then I had it with me. And so I ended up carrying my laptop. So I ended up separated from my guide. I had my laptop pitched on my head in the middle of the forest.
How was the Wi-Fi out there?
Yeah, the Wi-Fi was not working. And, I was walking in circles, and I can't remember how many hours I was alone and separated. I was exhausted at that point. The trip had been, I've been away for a couple months. It gave me just a momentary glimpse of the kind of terror that Fawcett and his party went through on a daily basis. And it's hard to tell the story in the sense that because it's not so much what happened, but it's what you feel internally. And
right.
There was a genuine sense of panic because, if you don't, I joke, but the truth is there's a feeling in a jungle almost like a whiteout, which is you become very disoriented and you can walk in circles because you don't really have a sense of direction. You don't see the sky. And you really, and the plants, unless you're a botanist, have a certain familiarity or similarity. And so you really get confused and disoriented. And so there was just that was a genuine moment of a dread, and it happily ended when I began to hear these wonderfully. They weren't wonderful. The first time they were these kind of strange cackling sounds, and I did not know what they were. And I saw things suddenly darting between the bushes. And I really was scared. I didn't know what they were. And then suddenly out of the forest burst all these little children. And they were members of the Kwikuru nation. And they had found me. And they led me back to their settlement.
And you found your ex-samba dancer guide.
Yes, I found my ex-samba who said, I'm sorry I didn't go back for you.
Thanks, man. All right, we're going to fast forward. We have a few more minutes here, and I know you've talked so much about Killers of the Flower Moon, which is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. And congratulations on, I hear that it is going to be becoming a film, and Martin Scorsese is attached, and Leonardo DiCaprio. Is this all true?
It's as true as Hollywood is, so it is.
So it's not true at all.
Exactly, you never know. At least it does seem, Scorsese's doing he's shooting, I think, The Irishman right now, and if all goes well, it will be his next project.
That's amazing. So it's a great book, and you've done a lot of interviews on it. I don't want to get into the story as much, but what I am really interested in about that book is just the process of researching it, because this is something that you do very well. I mean, you were able to find the diaries in this book. My understanding is that you heard about the story from a historian friend of yours, right? I guess they just mentioned it, like you said, maybe at a dinner party, and you were like, what's this story? I never heard about this story. Is that true? Or how did you find out about it?
So the interesting story, so I heard that there was a historian internally at the FBI. I read something. I was reading a story. It said something, there was a quote or saying and it said the FBI had its own historian. I thought, God, that's so strange. I didn't know the FBI had its own historian. And I just cold called him, and I said, my name's David Grann. And we just chatted about the FBI and the Bureau. And we talked a lot about COINTELPRO in the 70s. I said, are there interesting cases that you're aware of the Bureau, maybe things that have been written about? And at the very end of the conversation, he says, there was also this old case I don't know much about the Osage Nation. It was one of the Bureau cases. And so I got off the phone, and then I looked up a little bit about the Osage case. I thought, and there was really not much written about it, but I saw enough details, and he had mentioned enough details. I thought, this is kind of interesting. And that led me to make a trip out there to the Osage Nation. And at that point, I really didn't know if I would tell the story, or if there certainly wasn't necessarily thinking it'd be a book, but I just kind of wanted to get a better sense of, the story. And just for the listeners to know, it's basically about how the Osage Nation, members of the Osage Nation, Oklahoma, became the wealthiest people in the world back in the early 20th century because of oil under the land. And then they began to be serially murdered, and it became one of the FBI's first major homicide cases. So that was one of those stories where, you go back to what interests you. Well, there's a certain instinctual quality where you're like, whoa, that's a kind of astonishing story. And you're like, why don't I know about this? And so that also compels you. But there really wasn't much out there. So I made that trip out to the Osage Nation. And I think I described in the book, and I've told the story before, but I visited the Osage Nation's museum, and I saw this photograph on the wall, and it was taken in 1924. And it showed members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers. And it looked very innocent, but there was a portion of that photograph that had been cut out. And I asked the museum director, she'd later become a friend, it was the first time I met her though, what had happened to that? And she said it contained a figure so frightening, she decided to remove it. And she pointed to that missing panel, and she said the devil was standing right there. And so the book really grew out of trying to understand who that figure was and that anguishing history. And it led me, to what would really take me almost 5 years of research to do.
That's amazing. And we're not going to reveal right now who the devil is. Just buy the book. But 5 years of research before you started writing it, or as you were writing it?
No, the whole project took me 3 really intensive, one less. And then, one part of the 5th year, you're doing edits and getting ready for publication
right.
stuff. So I tend to, the 2 years of just all intensive research. And then at that point, I'm writing and researching different sections simultaneously.
Now, why do you feel the need to do such exhaustive research?
Well, in a case like that, my goal, is to try to write, and this is a case of history that has been largely neglected, largely overlooked, about what is really one of the most grave and serious racial injustices in American history, and really one of the most sinister conspiracies in American history. And yet,
it's horrible.
It's atrocious. And my desire is to tell that story that can let readers and let myself know what it was like to actually live through the times, to be in the midst of that conspiracy. What was it like to be in a family where members are being poisoned and shot? What was it like to deal with white law enforcement officers who were on the take or who neglected the cases because of prejudice? And so to do that narratively, to do it in a way that kind of has a beginning and a middle and an end, and hopefully as best as possible based on the available record, I can only do that based on the underlying research. And the reason it was so hard in a case like that is I wasn't dealing with Percy Fawcett, who kept compulsive diaries. I was dealing with people more on the margins or documents that have been censored. And so it took a long time to find those records, to find the oral histories, to find the secret grand jury testimony, all these things. It wasn't like you could just go to one archive and unlock it. But without that underlying material, I couldn't do it. And to be honest, there was still so much more I wish I knew.
I was going to ask you that. I said, I bet given your druthers, you would have researched another year.
You keep going. It goes back to your first question. Having some economic pressure in life as a writer is probably, sometimes it's destructive, but sometimes it's good, because you do need to, at some point, you have to accept some of the limitations that are out there.
Do you like deadlines? Are you somebody that works well with deadlines?
No, I hate them. God, no, never. Every deadline's been meant to be broken. No, I hate them. And I don't like stress. I write better actually when I'm not stressed. I'm actually faster when I'm not stressed.
Oh, that's cool. How do you get yourself into a place, before you write? Do you have a sort of ritual? Do you have a place that you tend to always do your writing?
I used to go to the New Yorker, but they moved buildings to the farther in the city, and I live in the burbs now, and so it's a really far commute. So I mostly now just my commute is just from my bedroom across the hallway into a little room where I do my work, and I don't really have any secrets. I'm slow and I get distracted, but I pretty much treat it like a job. I get to my desk usually. I read newspapers in the morning with my coffee, and then by 9 o'clock, I'm usually at my desk. I'm either researching, reading, writing, editing, and I work a full day. I break for lunch and maybe try to go for a walk in the afternoon. And it's totally unpredictable to me when writing will go well and when it won't. Writing has never been easy for me. It's always been a desire and a compulsion. But I know people who are really natural, easy writers. Writing has never been easy for me.
Those people are few and far between, by the way. Like people who actually really just enjoy it and are like, oh, this is amazing. I don't even trust those people because anybody who's really written knows that it's, like sweating blood or whatever they say.
And I've gotten older too, and I've seen people say this, but I think I saw this the other day and I thought, that has a certain truth. I don't even know who said it or where I saw it, but, for me, writing is revising. I mean, I am not a first draft man. I mean, my first drafts are hideous. I need to constantly rewrite to get it to a certain place that I want.
Do you put together an outline before you write, especially of a book, but also of a story?
So a book, 100%, and even a magazine piece that's long, I will always sketch some outline, and then informationally, I'll do outlines for sections just so that the information is more accessible. Often because I'm drawing a document, so I want to have it all condensed in areas. So let's say I was just doing, for example, this is not real, but let's just say for Percy Fawcett, I want all the information on his biography in a certain place that's accessible. And so I would have an outline where any information I'm getting from books, documents, my own interviews, I could collect and then draw on that.
Right.
And so I do that kind of.
So you pre-organized about it.
I pre-organized it, and like for the Osage case, for the book, that was unbelievably important because I literally had, by the end, I had tens of thousands of documents in my office.
Wow. Your wife must have loved that.
Oh my God. The real relief for that book came when I was able to pack up all those documents, put them in crates and put them into storage. I can now walk to my desk and I felt so much lighter. And that was all, but that book research-wise was as hard as anything I've done. And I also always say this too, you don't get any points for difficulty. And so my hope is that I probably don't always succeed, is you don't want to see the work. You need to kill off the things you spend a lot of time researching because they aren't essential to telling the story. Often I'll research so much and it'll just be a sentence.
Tiny little thing. Yeah.
Detail. And you research so much to get one detail. So you don't want, the research is so important, but then ultimately you want to shed the research, hopefully. And it's not always easy to do. That's a really hard process to do. But that's why I think you keep revising. For example, on almost any book, any piece I do, I will have historical digressions that go on way too long. And I will often end up cutting them down 50, 60% of what they were.
But you believe in just writing the first draft and then revising.
Well, and to be honest, when you're doing it, you don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have the clarity yet. I think what I'm doing is wonderfully important and brilliant. And then
right.
You come back.
That's totally
that
true.
Kind of sucks. And that's really, where did I go wrong there? And I'm falling asleep even reading it. So,
So are you working on a book right now that you can talk about? I
just finished a big piece for the New Yorker, which I'm actually pretty happy about. I'm not usually that happy with pieces, but it took a while to get done because I was on book tour and doing kind of other things. But it's about an explorer, but someone very different than Percy Fawcett, and it's about a different part of the world that I knew nothing about, Antarctica, and so that will run hopefully early next year. And if any listeners have a book idea, I will happily I promise them a nice dinner, a nice commission. They can email me at davidgrann@gmail.com.
Oh, really? Oh, you just said ideas for books?
Yeah, send them in. I'll take them when I get them.
Yeah, that's awesome.
You ask me where I get ideas, I get them anywhere. I'm not too proud to beg.
I'm going to close out with that song. Ain't too proud to beg. David, thank you so much for doing this.
All right,
You're the best. You are the best.
My pleasure.
Happy holidays.
You too, man.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to Right About Now, hosted by my dad, Jonathan Small. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to his podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you may find podcasts. Or you can go to his website, rightaboutnowmedia.com, and listen there. This is Ella, reminding you to do the right thing.
Thanks, Ella.
You're welcome.
Perfect.